Today I'll be talking about visualization, and Cary, Phillip Dunston, Polly Royal, and Fabian Winkler will be joining me. And welcome to CI Days 2010. So one of the first things I want to talk about was one of the resources we have on campus, and then I'll also lead into some of the projects. So if you've never been to the center before, it's located between the Stewart and PMU, about 30 feet underground, and next to the Starbucks. That'll be important later. So let some science begin. So what I've done here is sort of pulled from various pieces that I have of science-y things that I have. And basically you can see it covers a spectrum of visualization, from information visualization to actually displaying grids, to in the center here we see a laser scanning setup that we reconstructed a dog femur. And it really is all over the board. And what we do with SciViz is we supply tools. We figure out how to make tools work for you. We train how to use the tools. And sometimes, like in this airflow simulation up here in the corner, we actually try to push the envelope of what we can do, like when I try to hook up an HPC system up to a visualization platform and interact with it in real time for CFD. So, tools for collaboration. This is a clip that I borrowed from Kathleen Howe. We pulled this off last year at SC, basically showing how we can collaborate in 3D worlds that are very large. This was in Portland. One of the tools that we used was Envision as our tool. What we did was we pulled off a collaborative environment, basically spanning the country, where people were giving remote demonstrations. This is Wayne at Mission Control at Purdue giving his talk on zero-G gravity. So one of the things that's interesting about this is the size of the models and what we expect to display. In this environment, we were actually all working together in the environment. We were able to share the control of the visualization. We even had Wayne debug things while this was going on the show floor. GPUs, visualization resources. If you're doing the extreme, we talk about what GPU you have in your computer. This is an example of a GPU project that we're running where we're parsing and rendering national radar data, the NextRad system. Basically what's going on is large volumes of data are coming in every I don't know, 5 minutes or so. And these bricks are rendered out into tile sets. And this has actually been put together as part of a TerraGrid project that is made a Google gadget out of this. So you're able to actually, it's pre-generated. It's not like what we think of as interactive viz, but it gets the job done and allows it to scale. That's one of the things about viz that we always have to worry about when we talk about it has to go to the web. Well, if you have 1,000 people pulling on a GPU, the GPU dies. You know, you can't do it at this point. We don't have good technology for that. So one of the other things the center does is animations, and I'll show a clip of this. This is a student work. This was to get the point across about Condor. They were commissioned to create a video. So a lot of times we have grants that require outreach activities, and this is an example of something that could be used for that, where you're trying to get an idea or convey a message, and these animations play an important role. That's a nice clip of that. All right, then we get to immersive environments, and we'll have a lot more discussion about that from Phillip and Polly. This is an example of a prototype that we generated where we actually took CAD models from KUKA robots and made them look like actors. So the same technology that's used in the movie industry was applied to these robot frames. And why do are we interested in immersive environments like this? Because you can see, like in this animation sequence here with the robots, it's a complex environment. We could evaluate processes and procedures in this environment without really hurting anybody. Like if this virtual robot arm hits you, it's not going to kill you. And we also demonstrate this with complex manufacturing flows, where we're moving parts throughout a factory and we can actually see how the parts work together and realize it. So here's another example of where the visualization occurs on campus. It's in the classroom. We use a lot of classroom visualization, and it's more than PowerPoint. This is a clip that was from Kathleen Howe. We have a classroom in Armstrong that is equipped with a passive stereo system. That is part of a grant with Laura Kanan, Gary Bertolini, and Kathleen Howe, and we're seeking to extend that. So this is a prototype. And if they only knew what they looked like up here. All right. So another thing that the center does, and we have other resources, and I'll bring this up, is because we have other equipment. In the center we run not only the Viz equipment, but we have motion capture equipment as well. And this is an example of a motion capture project where two individuals are going to give each other a shove. And this is a unique resource on campus that is open. I do work with a lot of students that come over from like CGT and so forth that don't want to do all this motion building by hand. They want to cheat on their exam. That's what they want to do. But so this is an example of some other resources. So one of the other things that we get into is also games and social platforms. These are two examples. The EV Racer game has been a game that went on over the summer. It is a web-based, well, it's a Unity 3D-based game, but I get that question asked of me all the time, can it go to the web? Well, I found a tool that will take things to the web now, so I'm happy. The EV game has been at the State Fair, and it's been at SC 10. And the example on the let's see, it'd be the right, is a simulator where it's a village, and it's a social platform. So that means that we have multiple avatars in there. We tried Second Life, and it didn't get very far, so we built our own. And that was part of an RU project over the summer. But one of the things that we find in both of these are digital assets, where the students actually create models. That's the input a lot of times to the graphics environment that's not necessarily related to scientific visualization. And beyond, where do we go from here? This is a clip that Norman Joseph put together about a galaxy simulator. And I know that we've struggled with this a little bit because it's really requiring a lot of GPU horsepower to actually do the shading and so forth. But I want to point out that this is student-driven work. It's not just staff. It's helping the students do their work by providing information, training, and assistance. And basically, this is a good example of a project that's like that. So from there, I'll give a short recap of equipment and services. So we run a flex cave system. We have a tiled wall. We've also been doing work in active stereo monitors. I've been talking with several departments on campus, and there are actually researchers that are buying these and figuring out what works and what doesn't. A lot of times it's always a software problem. We're also working in the area of augmented reality. We have some use cases that came up where we got together with a group of faculty and sat down and talked about it and trying to see how we could pursue that with the existing tools so we're not reinventing the wheel. So we do software development, and I will include software development as being modeling as well. So we use Max or CAD tools to do the modeling. We can also do animations and graphics, and I don't just put movies there, but graphics in terms of you need a still shot for a presentation or so forth. We also run on commercial software, so I believe in having an entry point that is going to work out of the box in general instead of always going to open source tools. And the other thing we do is we supply training. So how do you get started working with the Viz resources on campus? Well, you have a question, that's a starting point. And then you contact us. You have an idea or starting a grant that may need visualization. Contact us. Need visualization development as part of an existing grant. Contact us. The reason why I say this and using this word contact us a lot is because a lot of people don't know that we even exist, that it's very difficult sometimes on a campus to find resources. It's usually a peer network that occurs where the information flows, unless I figure out a way to put a big neon sign or the Batman symbol above something. So with that, I'll leave up some contact information. And stop by the center. I will be there all afternoon and tomorrow as well. Okay? With that, I will introduce Cary Troy.
Thanks, David. My name is Cary Troy. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Civil Engineering. My research area could loosely be described as what we call environmental fluid mechanics, which is figuring out how air and water move around the Earth naturally. I'm going to talk to you today about a collaboration that I have with David that came about over the last few months, and it involves my research in Lake Michigan. The goals of my research as they relate to Lake Michigan are to develop robust computational representations of the physical processes in Lake Michigan. And the way I see it, there's sort of two different things that we're trying to capture with these models that we're running. The first one is, where is the water going in Lake Michigan as the wind blows over it and things like that. And then the second one that I'll describe it in detail a little bit more is related to the annual thermal cycle of the lake, the annual heating and cooling of the lake in relationship to the meteorological forcing. And then ultimately, once we have this robust model, we would like to apply it to a host of relevant problems, including climate change, trying to figure out how the Great Lakes will fare under various scenarios in the future. Invasive species, trying to figure out how things like Asian carp, once they get into the lake, may be moved around. Ecosystem function, where we're actually taking the circulation model and using it as the heart of a host of other coupled models that are representing the biological functions in the lake. And then another application would be pollutant and nutrient transport, where we're looking at how substances, things like bacteria or metals, get introduced into the lake and where they ultimately end up. And then the visualization part comes about when you actually try and take the results from these very sophisticated models and communicate them to stakeholders, so that would be government agencies and people actually making decisions about the fates of the lake, other scientists that are working in similar fields, and then the general public, which also includes students of a host of different a wide range of different ages. Okay, so the model that I use for Lake Michigan is called suntans. And I like to say it's a very sophisticated model with a very unsophisticated acronym. It's a Stanford hydrodynamic model. The full acronym is there. I won't bother reading it. It's used extensively for simulating coastal flows, oceanic flows, and the Great Lakes are really, you could think about them as inland seas. The physics of the Great Lakes are actually fairly similar to the coastal ocean, so you need a fairly robust model that can represent all the nonlinear processes. One of some of the attributes of the model as they relate to CI is that the model is unstructured, and what that means is that this is an example grid from Puget Sound, which is in Washington. We're looking from above. You see that you have elements, computational elements, that are a whole range of sizes, ranging from fine to very coarse as you move offshore. And that's kind of what you need for simulating environmental flows at full scale. It is a parallel model, and so I'll talk about how we leverage Purdue's resources to run it in parallel. And here are some of the applications where it's been used, and we're the first to really adapt this model to any sort of lake simulations. Okay, so this is an example of what our computational grid would look like. So it is a parallel model, and the first thing that you do when you're running this model is define your domain and break it into these different pieces of the pie that you can then send to different processors to calculate the different components of the flow. And I believe for the image that I'm showing you here, this would be an example of 16 different processors that are each going to take on part of that simulation and then have to talk to one another as the flow goes from one section to another. And we have done some tests where we look at the speed up of the flow and of the calculation, and it does do pretty well relative to what you would expect. We've used it on up to 64 processors, and we typically run it on the Coates cluster here at Purdue. I mentioned the unstructured grid in the horizontal, and then in the vertical direction you have variable spacing. And you have to get the water to move in the lake, and so how do you actually force a model like this? You want to use realistic winds and realistic temperatures and realistic meteorological conditions. There's a couple of ways that we've forced the model. One is using the NOAA reanalysis data. NOAA maintains a data set that is essentially their best guess. It's a combination between simulation results as well as observations of all sorts of environmental parameters around the world over the historical record. The other way that we've actually forced this model is working with a researcher in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Mike Baldwin has a real-time, very high-resolution weather model for the region, the Great Lakes region, and we have actually in the past coupled his real-time model to our lake model so that you have, in addition to predictions of weather, you can get lake weather, essentially, the circulation pattern in the lake predicted. And I'll talk a little bit about the physics of Lake Michigan just because that's what I know most about. I'm definitely, I think Russ was categorizing different users of CI. I'm definitely those that do not want to become a CI expert. But I definitely want to use the resources because once you get turned on to these tools, they quickly become something that you need. So Lake Michigan at its deepest point is about 300 meters deep. At the bottom of this slide down here, I have this kind of bowl-looking shape, which you can think about as a cross-section of the lake. The aspect ratio of Lake Michigan is actually about 2 pieces of paper. That's the true aspect ratio of Lake Michigan. So, we always think about it as a very deep lake because it's almost 900 feet deep, but it's also very wide. Okay, just to give you a background so that you can appreciate the simulations that I'll show you in a second. All of the Great Lakes experience a very strong cycle of heating and cooling. The sunlight penetrates to a certain depth in the water column, and by the middle of the summer, you end up with a picture that looks a lot like what I'm showing there. Warm water on the top and cold water on the bottom, and these two water masses are largely separate in terms of the dynamics of the lake. All of the motion in the Great Lakes is primarily driven by the wind. Because the Great Lakes are so big, however, you have to account for the fact that we're on a rotating Earth, and once you bring the Earth's rotation into the flow physics, it kind of throws your intuition out the window because it's not something that we experience day to day as we interact with fluids in our daily lives. This is an example of how we visualize that annual cycle of heating and cooling. It's a little hard to see the labels here. The top of this colored graph over here is the surface of the lake, and then as you move down along this graph, you're going deeper into the water. As you move from left to right, you are going from earlier in the year to late in the year. So this is a way that we give a time history over the depth of the water column of the temperatures in the lake. And what you see is that early in the spring you start with roughly isothermal conditions, and then by the time you get into the summer, you do have that warm water on the top and cold water on the bottom, and then you return to the isothermal conditions in the winter. Just a little background so that you can understand the simulations. What that means is that if you're a critter, or if you're somebody who goes to the beach, you can experience very wide ranges of temperatures in the nearshore region. And I think some of you probably already appreciate, for example, the Wisconsin coast is much, much colder in the summer than the Michigan coast, and you can go to the beach one day and have it be perfectly gorgeous water temperature, and the next day it's so cold you can't even stick your toe in it. These are some examples of water temperatures that we've measured at two different locations. One is Michigan City, which is along the coast of Indiana here, and then the other one is Muskegon, which is farther up the Michigan coast. And what you see is, this is day of the year 2009 and day of the year 2010. As you go through the year, you have these events where you all of a sudden are experiencing really cold water or really warm water. So an extreme climate of variability in the nearshore temperatures. I want to show you some of the output of our model. First is I would visualize it before using the Envision Center, and then looking at one of the simulations that they produced for us. This is a simulation looking from the top of the lake where we blow the wind from north to south. Confusingly, because the lakes are so large and the Earth's rotation is important, that will actually make cold water upwell on the Michigan coast, and that's what you're seeing in the blue there. The color is the temperature of the water. So this is one example of a typical still snapshot that we would use to visualize the output of this model. This is another example where we actually make a time series of the circulation in the lake. And obviously there's quite a few things missing in terms of you understanding what's going on in the simulation. Let's see if this works. This is an example of the movie that we are able to produce with the Envision Center, where you really can appreciate the full three-dimensionality of the flow. All of these environmental flows are highly three-dimensional, and you really are limited if you're only looking at time series at a point or even two-dimensional cross-sections. I must say that the first time I saw some of these animations in the Envision Center was the first time I felt like I really understood what this model was telling us. So that's I've started to think about visualization as more of a bottleneck in my own research, in that we have the resources and we perform the calculations at massive scales, but if you ultimately can't distill that information into some sort of a portable picture or an animation, you really haven't realized much of the potential of these simulations. One of the things that we're working on over in civil engineering, we recently renovated our lab, our hydrologic lab. We now have a tiled wall, so a collection of LCD monitors that we're going to be developing into a space, what we're calling a water visualization studio, where you can actually view these sort of animations on a very large, high-resolution scale. And it's a very cool space. If you have time to go over there and check it out, I recommend it. It has a waterfall in front of it, which makes it much more dramatic. But ultimately, we would like to develop sort of a satellite version of the Envision Center, and again, with me knowing nothing about how it operates ideally, and just being a user, to visualize these fluid flows for water researchers across campus. As some of the collaborations have evolved over the course of this project, the calculations involve using the Coates computer cluster, so massive parallel calculations. We received very generous seed support for the primary graduate student on the project from a CRI surge grant, which basically catalyzed a lot of this work. And then finally, without the Envision Center, we couldn't have pulled off the visualizations. So I was the one who made the comment about more humans in CI. So I would like to acknowledge the humans that worked on this project. Sultan Ahmed is the main graduate student who does the Lake Michigan work. Josh Harley is our civil engineering IT assistant. And then you have the Envision Center staff, David, Leaf, George, and Jake. And I'd like to acknowledge the support of the Cyber Center for the fellowship that enabled a lot of this work to get started. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Phillip Dunston. I'm an associate professor in the School of Civil Engineering. And Polly Royal and I will be tag teaming on this. I'll start off and she'll have we'll segue to a part that she's going to highlight, and then I'll wrap up our talk, and I'll let her tell you more about her experience when she steps forward. My area within civil engineering is construction engineering and management. What that more or less means is that I'm interested in the management and the engineering coming together to realize a project. I'm concerned about the entire life cycle of the constructed or facility or the built environment. So I came to visualization or to interest in it. First, looking at this problem of how to know where things should be placed, constructed, erected, assembled, installed on a project. Looking for something that was more effective than two-dimensional, abstract paper drawings. So I actually stepped into visualization first, exploring augmented reality. Most people come to virtual reality first and then maybe move into augmented reality. I came at it sort of backwards because first I was thinking of the field and then realized I had to look thoroughly across the life cycle of the facility for opportunities to leverage visualization. At the time, 3D modeling was very, very new, and only certain subcontractors were using it. Now it's become a lot more prevalent in terms of as a component of what's known as building information modeling, or BIM, if you ever talk to folks in the construction industry. So that's kind of the background that set me up for the opportunity that came about here when the Regan Street Center for Healthcare Engineering was looking at using virtual reality to do work on what we were calling then patient-centered care, and one aspect of that is patient-centered design of the hospital facility. And it sort of began with that, and I started working with a colleague in health sciences, Jim McLaughlin, and in association with others in the Regan Street Center. And I recognized that from my perspective, there was an opportunity here. If you look at that figure there, the picture, that's actually taken inside a warehouse. And what you're looking at are physical mock-ups that are constructed typically during the design phase. In other words, after a contractor is now on the project, they've already started construction. Before they get very far with the building, however, and while it's coming, the foundation work is being done, and before it gets too high, hopefully rising up, they're already working on these physical mock-ups so that stakeholders, we're talking primarily the hospital administrators and staff and professionals there, can come through, look at those physical mock-ups, and suddenly now actually recognize, oh, that's what the 2D plans were indicating that we're supposed to get. If you think about it, that's a little late in the process because the building footprint is set. A lot of design changes cannot occur at this stage. You're fairly well restricted. But this still is something that goes on because there's still a lot of issues to be resolved in terms of equipment and how it's actually going to fit. But I thought it would be nicer if that could be done a little bit sooner. Now, just to give you an idea why this costs so much, as I've indicated here on the slide, they're going to look at, as much as they can, how this is finally going to wind up. This is not the patient room. This is the physical mock-up, full build-out. And if you can imagine, that's constructed just to be wasted, right? So I saw that as something that didn't have to be if we've got visualization tools that can give you the full impression, at least visually, of the design intent. So I see virtual reality as what it's in many ways meant to be. It's a design, it's a communication medium. We can communicate through it as well as communicating within it. So this just kind of illustrates the idea. If you look at, the important thing is these curves here, 3 and 3 prime, basically this is the current situation. These physical mock-ups are being done somewhere out here. A lot of late design details or detailed design decisions are made sort of late in the design process. I'd like to use visualization to push that to an earlier point and fall under this influence line right here. In other words, I want to be able to make my decisions when I can have maximum impact on the functionality of the ultimate design that's going to be realized, and to avoid the increasing cost of any changes that would occur when we make the decisions later in the process. So that's kind of what's behind that from a design consideration. 3D models. As I mentioned when we started off, they weren't doing a lot of that, but they're doing more of it now, and this is actually the model as it would appear on the desktop, the first model that was done, a patient room, bariatric patient room. And I point out that this is a 2.5D experience, meaning you've got a 3D model, but you're looking at it still on a flat display, so you don't get the full sense of the space. So the motivation is to have an immersive experience where we can get a stronger impression of space and even functionality, because we're interested in how effective that room is in terms of the operations, the tasks that need to be performed there. We're focusing on patient care, of course, and we're concerned about the safety of the patient and the individuals giving care to the patient. So here you see things that we could recognize once we got this model up and running and we were able to step into this immersive experience inside the Flex Cave at the Envision Center. So these doors were actually positioned such that they created a dead space between them, so that was an inefficient design component there. This is just showing some of the functionality. There was quite a bit of it here. Opening drawers, moving things across the floor. You notice the bed is even raised there. We can move around different furnishings, including the chairs you saw in the previous slide. Getting the patient's perspective. You can imagine if we had a pediatrics unit that we were interested in, we could even scale it so that you could visualize that from the perspective of a child who's yay tall. Just thinking of other units in a hospital that we'd be interested in, the OR is the exciting one that I'd like us to get involved in next. This is just a sample of how an OR might be populated in terms of people as well as equipment during a surgical procedure. And just looking at that 2D plan view, you can see that's going to be quite busy. So if you think about communication that must go on, you think about the flow, the cooperation, and now if you're talking about the operating room of the future, you've got a lot of things hanging from the ceiling there to move about. There are flow David showed one of the images earlier talking about airflow. Well, in the operating room, the air should be flowing such that all the bugs are blown away from the patient, but now you've got all these things moving around, rotating above the operating table. That changes some dynamics. So a lot of interesting things there. Some of them a little bit far afield from my, my background, but I like inquiry and I like collaborating with people. That's one of the reasons that Polly and I are working together on some training issues that she's going to talk about. So this is just some quick shots from some of the assets, as David mentioned, that we have. So this is an operating room model that we actually were able to build. An interesting thing here to note is that when we first started with the patient room, that was something we started from scratch and it took months to do. And that was about, I think that was around 2006 or so, maybe a year earlier, but I think it was about 2006 when that was started. This operating room model, we actually were able to get it in a 3D form, had to be converted into a format, or had to be cleaned up, fixed up a little bit, and then converted into a format for virtual reality. And if I recall, it only took about 2 days just to get the basic model in. So we've come a long way. And I'm excited about that because as a user, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time in the development side of things. I want to get on to how we can now improve decision making, human performance if we're talking about training people. So, and then that gives us a segue to Polly's part right here, and then I'll step back in when she's done.
My name's Polly Royal. I'm a nurse in the School of Nursing. I'm a clinical assistant professor, which means I take the students to a living lab where people are living every day. And if you listen to the news at all lately, there's a big problem with people contracting infections while they're in the hospital that makes them die and not come out of the hospital. Just by a show of hands, how many of you have had your flu shot this year, had a needle stuck in you at any point in your life? Okay. Well, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to introduce a needle into a vessel, and we're going to thread a rubber conduit down to the tip of your heart. So this is a procedure that is obviously very high risk for infection, and it is also high volume. But a lot of times when you talk about high volume, you think, well, why don't you just take the students to the living lab and have them do it? Well, it's high risk, and most people don't particularly care for the students to practice on them in a high-risk environment. So anyway, we have a big problem with hospital-acquired infections, which most people know about. These bloodstream infections from the rubber conduit going from the outside into the inside, where the tip of your heart, typically cost about $45,000 to $50,000 to treat, which is non-reimbursable from any insurance company or Medicare, and often, 80% of the times, it results in death. So, and then obviously the sepsis from the central line catheters are very prominent. We did the high risk, high volume. And then what one person out at Johns Hopkins did, Peter Provost, was mirrored after aviation. There's a list of steps that you need to do. And if you do this, we can reduce the infections. But the people that are putting in the central lines say, you know, I do 100 of these a week, I'm very proficient at it, I don't need your help. Well, in a month, they audited, and 80% of the time, there was at least one step missing. So we need to practice on the steps so that we can reduce the infections. Unfortunately, Dr. Provost wasn't able to get the steps, the list, into common therapy or common practice at Johns Hopkins, so he did actually take it to our neighbor to the north, Michigan, and implemented it there in multiple hospitals, 11, And he was able to sustain over an 18-month period a 2/3 reduction in their hospital-acquired infections related to central lines. So we had a lot of success. Okay, these are the steps. There's 9 steps. This is not brain surgery. It is very simple. You got to make sure they're consented. You have to make sure you use the right disinfectant. You want to avoid the femoral site, which is down by your groin. You need to have a valid line for having a central line. But I want to impress upon you that a lot of people are afraid to go to the hospital. They don't want to go to the hospital. They want to leave as soon as possible because people die in the hospital. And a lot of therapies can be done at home, but these central lines are instrumental in getting the person to home care. Hand washing, foam in, foam out. Expect your provider to do that for you. Both the patient and the physician have to have full sterile attire. There's a timeout, which is where we stop, actively communicate, make sure we have the right patient, the right site, and all of the necessary equipment at the bedside. And then you want to shut the drape or the door to make sure that you knock out as much airflow as possible. The traditional way that we would introduce this to the students is, here's a list, go home and memorize it, right? Okay. Can be a little daunting for some people. Okay, in the immersive preparation, it is a desktop or a laptop interactive 2.5-minute scene where the steps are introduced in an interactive environment. Oh, nope. It won't launch. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Do you want to come do that for me, Dave? While he's doing that, I'll talk a little bit about what Phillip was talking about getting ideas from the civil engineers and the construction people to where the nurses can actually use it. A lot of times, hospitals are built by engineers and construction people, and the nurses are involved right away. And I think this visualization would get the nurses there sooner because they're actually the people that are working with the equipment the way it's set up. Okay? There's always been a joke in the hospital about, you know how tall your maintenance mans are. Oh, I'll let this go.
Has the patient consented yet? I'm in a hurry. Give me some betadine. I'm going to stick this in his femoral vein. I'm in a hurry. Why do I need to put a central line in anyway? Okay, I'm ready. Yes, I just did. Okay, now I'm ready. Okay, let's get started. Correct. Can we get started?
So the first time this runs through, which I think we're going to need to work on our timing because most students aren't quite as patient as you guys are. But the second time it runs through, the balloon above the nurse's head has a blank space and a pause so that the student can say what they're supposed to say. And then it does come up and show them that they are right or that they need to work on it. So traditional evaluation would be in the School of Nursing in a nursing lab, which is basically a big room. And as you can see just by looking at this particular picture, it looks like a classroom, and any student nurse beyond their freshman year would know that you would not do any procedure with an air conditioner at the head of the patient's bed. And we're trying to avoid infections here, okay? So the immersive evaluation is in the cave, and it is a moving thing where they will actually come in. The physician that you saw on the desktop is an animated person, and then the nurse is actually in there with the patient and the bed. Okay.
So now, just one quick thing. Another area of training that's a little bit more core to my industry is the training of construction equipment operators. And in recent years, let's say the last 10 years or so, equipment training, operator training simulators have hit the market. Obviously, as a result of the interest in gaming and the recognition that graphics quality and the ability to have real-time interactive systems is just sitting right there before us to be exploited. The thing I'm interested in, however, is the skill development and skill transfer. There are various setups. We just started with a low-end system commercially available. This is around $4,000. Some of the more expensive ones, $25,000. That's kind of the bulk of the range, and then there are some more expensive. As you might imagine, the more expensive, the fewer you'll actually find out there proliferated in the industry. So we're doing this as 2.5D right now, so this would be what you would see on our desktop right now, but what I'm interested in is exploring, as I said, skill development here as well as transfer. One of the things that David and I have talked about is actually being able to go from 2.5D to 3D. An immersive experience again. What impact will that have on the learning when you actually have that depth perception component in there and are able to actually capture some other things that the operator would visually be able to see more peripherally and even above when we hope in the future to have that opportunity to project that additional side of the cave. So this is something I'm excited about. I hope we can move in that direction because even though and I talked with the developer here, the vendor, they chose not to go with a stereo system for their reasons. A lot of it had to do with the way they evaluated it from a cost standpoint. From a researcher's perspective, cost is a secondary issue to me right now. I'm more interested in the learning and understanding how to learn effectively and to scientifically validate that. So I guess we're a little bit running over for time, so Fabian, you probably want to come right on up. If there are any questions, Polly and I might be able to quickly entertain one. Thank you.
My name is Fabian Winkler. I'm an assistant professor in the area of electronic and time-based art, which is housed in the School of Visual and Performing Arts. My talk today is about how the interdisciplinary educational model of ITaP, of my area, together with the services of the Envision Center for Data Perceptualization, enables students from various academic backgrounds at Purdue to experience learning or discovery at the intersection of art, science, and technology. And I would like to start with one example, the art garden in the Envision Center's cave. This is a project directed by one of our graduate students from Electronic and Time-Based Art, Jordan Cleland, who worked with his undergraduate students in a class AD 106, the Introduction to 3D Design, on 3D models that they then loaded into the cave. Oops. It's a movie, yes.
I'm here at Purdue's Envision Center for Data Perceptualization with Jordan Cleland, a graduate student in ITaP and a teaching assistant. Jordan is working with his students from his 3D Foundations class on virtual reality visualizations of the digital models they created in the course.
These are the students' first real experiments in a 3D modeling program, and here at the Envision Center, it really gives them a chance to see their work in an immersive environment.
We are now visiting ITaP's main computing space, which is also housed in the Envision Center. So I'll stop here and then just continue. Is it here, the presentation? Yeah, okay. There we go. All right. And continue with another project, which we just finished in the fall. It was the experimental 3D game development workshop that I co-organized together with Christian Barrett, a student researcher in the Envision Center. And in a series of 4 consecutive workshops over 4 weeks, we introduced students from all different kinds of backgrounds here at Purdue to the basics of 3D game development using the Unity 3D engine game development environment. This is a screenshot from the website that's still up, and at the end of my presentation you also get the link how to access it, because it still features all the individual handouts and all the individual workshop topics that we went through in this project. And I just wanted to highlight one of the works that came out of this workshop series from Yagis Mungan, who is a current graduate student in electronic and time-based art, who has quite an interesting background coming from an engineering degree at Chalmers University, who received a master's in engineering before and now enrolled in electronic and time-based art in our master's program, the Masters of Fine Art program. This work is about the navigation of a maze in quite an untraditional way, where you'd usually use visual clues to navigate this maze that you can see in the top left corner here. Yagis deliberately made the visual navigation vague, as you see from these 3 screenshots around here. This is what you would actually see or experience in the game. But instead, he emphasized navigation of this environment, of this maze, by listening to sound cues, spatialized sounds and musical scores that he embedded in the game environment. So I found this quite an interesting approach to alternative forms of navigating 3D virtual spaces. I also want to briefly talk about some models for interdisciplinary project work and education at the intersection of art, science, and technology. Obviously, one historical example is the Experiments in Art and Technology group from the late 1960s, founded by Billy Kluver and Robert Rauschenberg. It was interesting to hear John talk about, in his opening remarks, about the idea of technology that becomes more and more embedded into all aspects of life. And already in the 1960s, in this statement of purpose from EIT, we can read in the middle of this document the quote, "To eliminate the separation of the individual from technological change and expand and enrich technology to give the individual variety, pleasure, and avenues for exploration and involvement in contemporary life." More contemporary examples of some of the models that I use in my area of electronic and time-based art is, for example, Dorkbot, a a group of loosely connected clubs, so to say, that provide avenues and meeting spaces, workshops, and so forth for, as it reads in the poster here, people doing strange things with electricity. But then also Make Projects, the blog of the Make magazine from O'Reilly Press that actually has the subtitle Build, Hack, Tweet, Share, Discover. So these are all inspirations for our work as well. And with this I want to come to my last project that I wanted to show today, which is a project funded by the National Science Foundation called Images of Nature. It's a collaboration between Shannon McMullen, my colleague in the area of electronic and time-based art, myself, and then also David Braun in the Envision Center of Data Perceptualization. It's a project, as it reads here in the subtitle, about the technological explorations of the natural environment combining art, science, and engineering strategies in an educational model for collaborative creation. It is set up in 3 parts, the first part being an interdisciplinary course at Purdue, which will start in the spring 2011, so after everybody comes back from winter break, which tries to bring together students from different academic disciplines at Purdue, mainly the arts and humanities, the sciences, and also engineering and technology, to work collaboratively on projects that will result in artifacts, as we call them, that respond to the challenges of our changing natural environment, climate change, global warming, energy consumption, to name only a few, which will then be exhibited, and this is part 2 of the project, in an exhibition in downtown Lafayette in May 2011. And then the third part is a summer program at Purdue where we invite high school students from demographic groups that are currently underrepresented at the university to also experience this idea of interdisciplinary project work between the arts, sciences, and engineering, and to give them an idea that in an academic environment such as Purdue, they don't have to specifically choose only one singular discipline and, so to say, forget about all their other interests, but that they can successfully combine interests in many different disciplines and even succeed very well in doing that and actually stand out and thrive. In this project, we are specifically interested in this idea of the image and contemporary notions of images. So we try to expand on the idea of image to include polysensorial images as well, so images that go beyond the sense of sight to include other forms of using the body to get information about certain kind of ideas or the environment, haptics, sound, for example, immersion. But then also the idea of images as metaphors and how we can successfully, possibly even combine both notions of images. And I found very helpful a quote from Hans Belting, who is an art historian and theoretician from Germany, who recently wrote a text called Image, Medium, Body, A New Approach to Iconology. And he mentions the work of W.J.T. Mitchell explaining that iconology usually or traditionally has been a combination of the terms image, text, and ideology. And then Belting continues, in my recent book on Bildanthropologie, which is image anthropology, I also use a triad of terms in which, for obvious reasons, image remains, but now is framed by the terms medium and body, so that the body becomes a central element in this exploration and response to images. He also continues to say, we cannot speak of images in just one sense, but rather must classify images with different aims and effects. Images that serve our cognition are very different from those that address our imagination. And I just wanted to show you one brief example at the end of my presentation that illustrates how, in this very specific case, wind power can be represented in different images. Obviously here we have a map of the US Department of Energy. It's a very straightforward representation of certain kind of areas of high wind power in Indiana. We see just northwest of us the Benton County wind farm that hopefully many of you have already visited. It's quite impressive to go there. But there are obviously also other ways that we can talk about wind power, visualize wind power. And I just wanted to show this, I find quite interesting example of the advertisement that the North Pole and Hamburg agency created for Epuron, which is a German energy company, in 2007, called Mr. W. Do I have to do the same? Okay, so I can just go. Is it here? Ah, yeah, okay.
I think I was always misunderstood. People just didn't seem to like me. I think I annoyed them. I got on their nerves. I don't know why. That's just the way it was. Yeah. Maybe I was too intense. Maybe I came on too strong. I don't know. I really can't say. Yeah, it was lonely. Really lonely. But you get used to it after a while. And then, one day, everything changed. Somebody finally accepted me for what I am. Since I've got this job, life is completely different. I finally feel useful, good at something.
So this just as an example also of one type of images that we certainly try to explore in this course as well. And this brings me to the end of the presentation. I just have one last slide with my email address if you guys have any further questions, or would like to contact me directly, and then also some of the resources that I showed in my presentation. Thank you very much.